Welcome to Capacity Building with the Acosta Institute. My name is Dr. Angel Acosta. I'm here with Sister Maria Tan and Drisana McDaniel, inviting the community to deepen our understanding, definition, and practice of capacity building. In our last episode, we attempted to define capacity building in a variety of ways, and here we want to deepen our exploration on the concept. And both in the last episode and in between this episode and that previous one, we've been just continuing our dialogue, both in the work we do in the community with our consulting and our public programming at the Acosta Institute, and also just in our one-on-one and team conversations. And just excited to talk more. Sister Maria, Sister Drew, I know that a lot has come up, in our dialogue since our last conversation around time, around the relationship to time and capacity building. Capacity, there's a counterintuitive aspect of capacity building that I think is important for us to raise. Where do we want to begin? I'm excited.
Yeah, I would love to begin with the ways in which capacity building is counterintuitive. And I started to really think about that after our last conversation when Drew quoted Bayo Komolafe saying that times are urgent, therefore we must slow down. And I feel the counterintuitive nature in that statement. And I think part of capacity building, as we've already touched on, is the ability to hold paradox, which in and of itself is counterintuitive. So when we're being explicit around the ways and how we're building capacity, I think we also need to name the ways in which we have before that are no longer working, and the new ways in which we need to create the spaces for capacity. Yeah, I'll pause there.
So what occurs to me immediately when hearing that is how one of the things that makes capacity building a counterintuitive concept is that capacity building is about making space. It's really, I don't think it's about constantly accumulating skills as much as it's about making the sort of space that enables us to do things like grapple with paradox and innovate. And even like be patient enough to recognize emergence, which we have described as a skill. So where I think that capacity building is often thought of as like accumulating several different skills in order to better manage workload or better show up in relationships, I think at the heart of capacity building is the making of space. And that is also what I hear from folks that, that we've talked to in this work is the hardest thing, is like really creating space to be reflective and recognizing that everyone has different needs when it comes to that. So that feels very counterintuitive, given that when people are brought into organizations or spaces to do a certain type of work, they're just, they're not just, but, there's an expectation for productivity around that. And what ideas or what justifies or what qualifies as productivity, I think is what we can sort of trouble a little bit. This idea of productivity being doing, being seen doing, versus also like what productivity might look like for some of us, which might be walking, which might be biking, which might be sitting in quiet. So yeah, making space seems pretty counterintuitive and also absolutely essential to capacity building.
Yeah, making space, slowing down, and in the spirit of troubling, right? the conversation, times are urgent, therefore we must slow down, So this idea of like slowing down in an organization, in a relationship, in a conversation to build capacity to hold more, hold paradox, deepen resilience, deepen the capacity to navigate change. I'm just being playful here, just because as we've worked together for the last 4 years, we've done a lot of slow work, but we've also done a lot of fast work. Like we've gone on like sprints where we're doing a lot. So I'm wondering how true it also is that in order to slow down, we have to speed up. Like in order to afford the capacity to slow down, that there has to be a time in an organization's life, or in a moment in an organization, where there is a level of speed. And the clearest way to kind of really make that even more concrete, speed not as a function of necessarily time and velocity, but speed in terms of resources, right? So organizations that are cash strapped or are struggling financially have to always be on that hamster wheel of kind of the hustle, you know? And what I've noticed, and Maria, you've been privy to this since day one, and Drew, you've seen this. Like one of the big reasons why I think for us we've been able to play so much, and to when we can and when we want to be intentional about like slowing down, is precisely because financially we've been able to work at a certain clip that allows us to generate the resources and the social and economic safety net to make a bold decision, like we're going to slow down now. We're going to slow down now. So I'm wondering, just like the paradox there, that yes, the times are urgent, therefore we must slow down, but also as organizations and as individuals, we want to be intentional about what are the resources necessary for slowing down. Because by itself, the quote, the saying, is timely and is powerful. But I think in practice, it gets a little complicated. This might be a good moment to push on Drew. She's been thinking a lot about temporality. This idea, Drew, would you share a little bit about what you mean by that?
I mean, temporalities, as I'm knowing right now, really has to do with our experience of time and our relationship with time. And so even as you were just speaking now, I jotted down this idea that speed can be a function of generative energy, like that attunement to what is needed is important. But there's also this so another part of capacity building, I think, is like genuine curiosity, right? So like this sort of recognition that we're all in relationship with time differently. For example, and this is, this may take us down a hatch when we think about the fact that we're all differently abled. We have to think about how people, let's say with disabilities or whatever, swim through time differently because of the barriers that are in the way, right? So there's this way that we have to become really curious about how time works for other people. We know here in this country, for example, we changed the time so that people can literally be more productive when the light is out, right? It's specifically so that we can be more productive. And so just thinking about like the ways that we kind of expect people to conform, I think, to time is another form of capacity, right? To have and to hold. For example, I feel like when I think about the ways that we work, and I really appreciate it, like we have work, but we have our own timing with getting the work done. And there's really no weird pressure around it either, right? There's this sort of understanding of, I know what your life is like. I know what your life is like. I know what your life is like. And I know that this work is important to you. So there's no like, I need this now, because we are in relationship with the work. We cherish the work. We value the work. We cherish each other. We value each other. And because of that, we can also lean into our own relationships with time, which I think is so important. And I'm going to be really, explicit also. After working for people for 20 years, like working a job where they literally wanted X amount of hours, I recognize the privilege and luxury I have of being able to find my own relationship to time in such a way that I know by the way it feels in my body, by the way my nervous system responds, and the way that I can create as a result of that. I recognize that is quite a luxury and a privilege, but there is a way that I'm really curious about how that can become a capacity that people consider for all of the types of ways that we're being in the world with our work. And that requires a paradigm shift, I think, to be able to trust enough. And we know that that's a capacity too, right? To be able to trust enough that we're so committed to the work of our purpose that we are going to be in sync with it in the way that it works for us and our sense of time and temporality, our relationship to time. That's a capacity that, again, is counterintuitive because people are, well, you need to be here X amount of hours. Well, the reality is I can probably get what I need to get done in 2 of those hours. People don't want to hear that because we're so practiced in, it's so normal to consider that people are reduced to what they can do in an hour and what they should earn as a result. So there's so much there, I think, to continue to explore and have conversations about. What do you think, Maria?
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that you're inviting us to think that and remember that everyone relates to time differently. I really appreciate also that within the Acosta Institute, in our relationship and our work, we almost never use the word urgent. We almost never use the word priority. Yet we know when things need to get done, right? But we're not using this language that I'm reading right now, World is Love or World is Self by Joanna Macy. And she has a whole chapter on time, and she talks about this hurried sickness, that actually being in a state of hurry and rushing and urgent priority deadlines actually contributes to sickness, physical illness. So I'm just really appreciating that we've found a way to operate in a different paradigm when it comes to that. And I think it is because we're in the work of our purpose, as you said, Drew. So I think this conversation is really making me think of, one, how everyone relates differently to time, and how the mainstream productivity conversation around time, narrative around time, is very violent in ways and harmful. But there is a way, going back to your troubling, Angel, there is a way to operate in this different paradigm where things are moving along. There are things being accomplished, but it's still not within that pressure and that language and that hurried sickness. So I'm curious, and this is to you, Angel, like, how do you think we created that culture?
Yeah, I think it's part of it is risk. Reminds me of the work of the critical care scholars. Care as a philosophical concept in the 90s was a book called The Call to Care by Nell Noddings. Beautiful contribution to the field. And she, in the book, at the time, she was inviting the world really to reconsider the power of nurture, of care, of real deep support for people at an emotional level. She comes out of feminism and feminist philosophy, and a few African American scholars took the work and expanded it, calling it critical care, and said that, it's not just universal ideas of caring and being nurturing, but it's caring within a particular political economy, caring within a particular community, caring in a very specific way in terms of the communities that you're embedded in. So that universal care has to become particular at some point. And in that work, there's this idea called the ethics of risk. The ethics of risk, and long story short, it's what we risk by not acting, by not deciding, by not doing. But for me, I also interpret that in terms of how we relate to time, is that we need to stop doing work the way we do it, in terms of the pressurized, intense, urgent laden way that we do it. Because if not, we risk our health. We risk our or just being on this planet. So for me, it's a fundamental commitment to care, and caring for myself, caring for those who work with me. But again, there's also a risk too, because, as we work with clients in our consulting practice, as we work with community members with our public programming, we have to account for the needs of the clients and the needs of the community. So with that, comes this really important part, which is setting boundaries and expectations in the beginning, right? So when I work with a big company like Salesforce or Facebook, or how do you say we're going to do slow work? So there's a way that has to be communicated, depending on the nature of the consulting. And then also when we do public programming, that the people who are coming to our summits, coming to our courses, coming to our offerings, that from the first engagement, they feel this different sense of being. We'll get to whatever you need. We'll get to meeting your needs, but it also couch within the needs of all of us, both those that are delivering the content and those who are receiving it. So that's what I would kind of say as my initial response. But this brings up this other piece, which I'd like to kind of get both of your perspectives around capacity building in these times of transition and change. I noticed that time is a feature and an aspect, right, of this work, but so much of the capacity that I'm called upon to build, to lean on, to use, is accounting for needs, accounting for the needs of clients, accounting for needs of team members, accounting for my needs, accounting for needs for my family, accounting for needs for my community. So I'm just struck by how much capacity building, when broken down into really practical levels, is how do we build the capacity to tend to, respond to, be with the matrix of needs that we're embedded in. And at what point does accounting for certain needs of a client or certain needs of a community members then over pronates or over extends one person, or overextend an organization. And in that overextension is where critical conversations around capacity can come up. These needs are not being met. We need to kind of expand here, find more resources, find other ways of doing work. Just some random thoughts there.
Yeah, in understanding the matrix of needs, is that what you called it? I love that. Understanding the matrix of needs, I think first presents itself as very complicated, right? There's needs of me, there's needs of the client, there's all these needs. So I think a helpful thing to think about, kind of going back to culture, is how are people used to expressing their needs, and how do we create a way where we can have healthy communication around communicating our needs? Because sometimes needs show up through reactivity. Sometimes needs they show up in a lot of ways. And sometimes ways that cause conflict. So I think part of capacity building is creating language around how to speak needs, how to understand your own needs, other people's needs. So yeah, just creating conversation around it, I think, is a critical piece to that. I'm still in the practice of learning to ask myself, what do I need? What do I need in this moment? So I know if I'm still practicing that, many other people are still practicing that. And then there's the next layer of understanding someone else's needs, especially when it's not typical to be communicating them to each other.
There we go. Yeah. There we go. That's really like, thank you. I needed to hear something. I need some. So yeah, I think that like this goes back to emergence. This goes back to like what do we need to be well? What does our culture need to like thrive? What do our what types of systems do we need to engage with, and how do they need to be changed, transformed, I guess, or extended, or making more space for possibilities. And so I think it gets back to the risk piece. Like I definitely relate to I want to be able to discuss what I need, and at the same time I'm just coming from a culture where it doesn't matter what you need, it's just work for what you need. Right? It's like what you need is we've already negotiated that and in our agreements, and this is what you get paid to do what you do. So I think that, yeah, back to risk and critical care. It's back to that again. It's like, how do we create cultures of care and continue to iterate? And how do we also maybe create spaces to do such things that help enable us to be able to discuss our needs, which is another form of capacity. To even know what we need, I think, is another type of capacity, right? And so how do organizations, iterate in such a way that they're practicing experimenting with that kind of risk and creating a different space to work in? And obviously that's slow work too, right? But I think that when we get back to this idea of capacity building or making space for new ways of being, that one of the things that we recognize, and this became very, very, very clear, especially during the pandemic, when thinking about how we want to work as people, because we've experienced this other way of being that, while it was fraught with a lot of pain and devastation, it also was informative in terms of like who we are, because we had to fall out of, many of us, not all of us, but some of us had to fall out of the traditional ways that we were working. So we came to know ourselves differently, which I can say at least also informed me in such a way where I knew, oh, I can actually work in such a way that I care deeply for the people that I work with. Oh, I can show up with the entirety of myself. I don't have to shift and show up as worker Drew, and then shift to mother Drew, and then shift to scholar Drew. That all of that can show up. And if all of that shows up, because we want spaces where we can be whole, because being whole people with all of our nuance and complexities is what adds to innovation and helps to grow our spaces, then we also have to figure out then how we are able to tend to the needs of that whole person. But it's relatively new, I think. I mean, I don't know that people are hiring and saying, we really want you to bring your whole self to this space, And I think that is what we all are yearning for, though. Like really what is it like to be able to say to people like I do? I say often, I'm like, I'm so fortunate. I work with people I deeply care about and who care about me. Like that is, I think, how it can be. I don't feel like it's super special because there's more than just me, right? I think experiencing that, but that is what I think people are yearning for. And that is what I think that is part of this project of capacity building.
Yeah, and just to close out this conversation, part of what I want to invite us here and those of you who are listening to think about is that, this is an emerging conversation, and we're being, I think, really bold in putting our minds on the line and thinking out loud about this, knowing that we don't have all the answers, and knowing that we have some experience around it, but really being in a vulnerable public inquiry. So I'm really excited about how this conversation is going to mature over time, and how we will change in terms of our perspective. Yeah, it's just a fascinating time to think about this. The last thing I'll say is that when things are really intense, right? When there's a lot of change happening in society, not just political, but also environmental, technological. There's so much fear. There's so much disorientation that can happen. So on the one hand, the capacity building framework helps to kind of ask questions around, what do we need? What do we need right now to adapt? What do we need to adjust? What do we need to expand as individuals, as organizations? But I think what's more important, what I'm getting from this conversation and the last one and the many that'll come, is breaking down what we need, breaking down what we need in this moment, and that as we identify the needs, then it becomes clear what capacities need to be enhanced, need to be leveraged, need to be deployed that we already have. Reminds me of the language of neuroscience. When you think about the nervous system, like, for example, mindfulness upregulates. Mindfulness upregulates our capacity to hold and deal with stress, right? And it also upregulates our pro-social behavior, because it allows us to be less stressed. That means that we have more capacity to be present to other people to a certain degree. Now, just intense acute stress itself downregulates our capacity to be patient, to be collaborative. It intensifies antisocial behavior. So just drawing on that kind of language, I'm wondering, the benefits of thinking about our needs, the capacities we already have, the ones we need, and how they can upregulate, downregulate, certain behaviors that we need to adapt to the onslaught of challenges that are before us. So just a playful kind of contribution there. Any last words before we transition?
Well, I like the idea of thinking about that and thinking about that out loud together. That is, I look forward to really thinking about, and we're touching on, at this point, we're getting to embodiment, and so I look forward to incorporating that into our conversation.
Yeah, I'm appreciating your use of upregulate and downregulate, and the thought of capacity building, right? We kind of talk about capacity building and we're like going like this with our bodies. So I'm interested to begin to use that: upregulate, downregulate, grow, expand, let go, all of these different movements as we talk about capacity building. And I think what you brought up with the stress and how that downregulates us can help us kind of be like a litmus test for if our relationship to time is making us sick, or if our relationship to time and, the need to speed up is appropriate. So just appreciating that.
Wow, wow, wow. That's profound.
That's precisely why these conversations are going to be so powerful for us, So thank you for that, Maria. Thank you, Drew. Thank you for everyone watching. Stay tuned for our next episode. Check out our work at acostainstitute.com.